Welcome to Game Dev Week. Um, Today we're going to be I'm going to be talking or rambling a bit about roguelikes. I didn't really know what I wanted to talk specifically about roguelikes when I started this talk, but I think a better title for this now would be like an exploration of like the etymology of roguelike and also like where roguelikes came from, what they evolved out of, and like what they're becoming now, and like how you can understand the roguelike game as a framework when maybe designing or like coming up with an idea for a new roguey game, right? So clearly like we're talking about like I just put the rogues here because I like them, but we're not actually talk like to be a roguelike you don't have to be a rogue, right? You don't have to be like a cool stealthy guy who goes rogue, goes alone with the daggers. Um, what we're really talking about are, if you're not familiar with them, like some of these types of games, um, where, well, we'll go into in more detail like what it makes a roguelike, like what defines a roguelike in a little bit. But when people refer to roguelikes nowadays, what they're probably referring to is something like one of these, right? One of these really popular, commercially successful, super fun and amazing experiences. Um, but yeah, before we define it, let's give a little like brief history of the word roguelike. So, where did the term come from? Well, it came from this 1980s game called Rogue. It was just called Rogue, and what it really was a dungeon crawling video game made for like Unix-based mainframe systems, like meaning like shared computing time computers, basically. Uh, Made by like Michael Toy, Glenn Wickman. I hope I'm not mispronouncing their names. At UC Santa Cruz, so like just two college-aged people like us, and later at Berkeley, I guess like one of them went to grad school or something. Met up with this third guy, Ken Arnold, and they also did it. And they made Rogue. And what was Rogue? Well, it was a terminal game. It was entirely drawn in the terminal. Like I don't know if I'm sharing a screen right now, but like one of these things. Am I sharing a screen or?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So yeah, you just run it in one of these. In fact, I could do it right now, right? And here's the game, and you can move around, explore different areas. I picked up 8 pieces of gold. You can go up and through corridors. It's a long corridor into other rooms, and then there are enemies, and you can fight them, and it's really cool. And I don't know how to exit the game, so I just Control Z seemed to do it. Okay, but yeah, it looked like that. It was a terminal game, and what it simulated back then was like a fantasy dungeon crawling game, and you had to navigate to the bottom of like levels of dungeons and acquire the amulet of Yendor, which little fun fact from Wikipedia, not sure if it's actually true. They reportedly named it Yendor after Rodney spelled backwards. Anyways, this game Rogue became really popular in the 80s amongst like the primordial gamers of the time, back before like gaming had, or like back when there weren't as many options for games. Like this was one of the popular ones amongst like a diehard fan base, basically. And I sort of spoiled it because I just couldn't help myself. But yeah, this is what it looks like. This is what Rogue looks like. It bears to say like there are different ports of it that have been distributed over time, and like slightly different versions of it. And then they'd eventually come to be called different names. But yeah, Rogue looks like this. Its controls, like most games of these era, are awful. They hadn't invented WASD yet, so it's actually like if you look at your keyboard right now, find H, J, K, and L. Those are like where you're supposed to place your fingers and move around with. H is left, L is right, K is up, and J is down, I think. Um, and so yeah, the controls are really clunky. But this is where it all started. This is where it all went down. And like I said, you can actually play this in a terminal if you have like a Linux system. It's especially easy. You can just apt install one of this thing, BSD games, non-free. I don't know why it's called non-free because it's definitely free. And then play Rogue like I just did. So if you're interested in playing the first roguelike ever, yeah, give it a shot. doesn't take much time. But yeah, rogue is where the term came from. Everything else would be referred to as roguelike hereafter. What are the traits about rogue that were like so interesting to everyone? Why did people really get into roguelikes and build a whole genre out of it, basically, off this one game? Well, it had a couple interesting traits. First of all, first of all, we had random dungeon generation. So each time you would go through the levels, it would be different every time, right? That was a critical trait of Rogue. There's permadeath, meaning that if you died at any point along the dungeon, you just restart in a new randomly generated dungeon at the very top, and have to descend again. It was turn-based, so you take turns moving, and then like all the monsters on the screen would then take their move in some defined order. It was grid-based, as you could see. It's non-modal, which is sort of interesting. It means that you can always like take whatever path you want through the level, and it's more like knowledge-based rather than something that is gated like Metroidvania. Like in a game like Rogue, they didn't have like double jump that you could pick up and then progress to new areas from, or anything like that, or keys that you could only unlock after beating the game, and then you could go through and unlock other like paths in the game. There's nothing like that. Everything is available from the start. You could theoretically solve the whole game on your first try, is what that, I think, means. And sort of building on that is the complexity factor. There are multiple ways or paths to reach the goal of the game. There's no like defined or like solved like solution or strategy that would beat Rogue. And there's resource management involved, and it's a hack and slash, meaning like there's a ton of enemies that you have to go and beat your way through. And I didn't pull these out of my butt. This is actually called like the Berlin interpretation of roguelikes, which basically there was this roguelike conference, like game development conference in 2008, and this is what they came up with. Like what are like the concrete pieces of Rogue that inspired other games or like the genre. And what you'll find is that over time, people will start to break these rules and spawn new games that are roguelike, or maybe only roguelite, but we'll talk more about that. So, but the first roguelike games really were a lot like Rogue, as in they had pretty much all of these elements. And here are some examples, right? We have Moria, which is, it came out in '83 or something, I think, which I have that information on one of the later slides, I think. But yeah, there's Moria, which does much of the same thing, but has a slightly different interface and probably content in game. There's also like NetHack and ADOM. ADOM actually has a version you can buy on Steam, and it looks pretty nice now. But they are all, see, it's grid-based, turn-based, randomly generated dungeons, all of that stuff. So these are strictly rogue-like games, and they sort of built out off of each other and sort of evolved into a pretty solid or like coherent genre. And people started. And another observation is that roguelike, the term roguelike is very similar to other labels we throw around in game dev, which is like Doom, or like not game dev, but like gaming, I guess, in general. Like Doom clone, Minecraft clone. Like some of these became like, I guess, a bad word, like did almost a little derogatory towards games later on. But it's the same construct. It's like, hey, you want more games like Rogue, or you want more games like Doom? Well, this is a Rogue-like, or this is a Doom-like, or Doom clone, Minecraft-like, Minecraft clone. That's sort of like the origin of the word roguelike. And then what people realized, basically, is we have this set of like rules that built Rogue, or built games like Rogue, and they were very popular at the time. And some endeavoring young game devs were like, well, what traits of Rogue are we going to keep, and what are we going to change, basically? And like, what is core to or innovative about Rogue, and what could we build on or build new, better games in the genre, basically. So I would say random generate. This is sort of like my own argument now. I'd say like random dungeon generation is like a good point that Rogue made. Like what Rogue did with random dungeon generation is it allowed it to basically uh, generate new and interesting ways to explore and discover every time, and it prevented things from getting stale because every time you died, you basically had to replay the same game loop. And so what much of what was interesting about Rogue is the methods it used to like stave off the staleness of the dungeons, right? And so if you have the same dungeon every time, that's a problem because you're dying every time. You don't want to relive the same dungeon over and over. The turn-based aspect, however, is like sort of foddery. It's just it's the way that a game was implemented using like this amazing idea. Same with like the grid-based. The non-modal is sort of iffy because the every action being available always and like being able to take multiple routes or like employ different ways or like means to reach the end goal can make the game less stale. But we'll see later on that actually there are examples of games that don't do this that much and actually get rid of this one too. And complexity, again, like multiple solutions, ways to get the goal. Much like multimodal or non-modal rather, you want to basically pump up the replayability of your randomly generated dungeon by making things more complex. Resource management, again, we'll see things later that sort of break this rule, but or even add to this rule. And a hack and slash, like fighting your way through enemies, or defeating a wave of enemies, can take it or leave it. What I want to emphasize here is that what we'll see is that these three features are like the most critical to like coherent to the roguelike genre, and we'll see why. Right, so here's like a sort of like a state machine that you can follow to understand a roguelike, right? So you have a start, right? This could just be like a menu. It could be as simple as a menu, or it could be a hub, or something more interesting later on. But the point is that you start the game, right? You load up, you do a run. So you're thrown into this randomly generated world. It's always different every time. And almost inevitably, the challenge is going to be too much, such that you suffer a horrible and inevitable death by some interesting being, and get sent back to the start. And then the user is basically supposed to start up another run and try again, with the hopes that they can eventually win. But something interesting about roguelikes is that also when you win, the reward is that you get to go back and start again. It's the same outcome as if you had died. The idea is just to keep replaying the same dungeon over and over, and basically this randomly generated world acts as like a black box that produces new and interesting scenarios each time you run through it. That is what I would call like the fundamental innovation I see in Rogue, and like why it sort of spawned a genre. Is it created this mentality as a game developer that we need to basically find ways to make this randomly generated black box as big and interesting and replayable as possible, and then make it as efficient and easy as possible for the player to restart the run and basically do it over and over again. And because the roguelike really is only as fun, it's only as replayable as the black box, right? At least for now. And this sort of is where like my background knowledge, or like where a lot of us probably come in here, is we've started playing these derivatives of Rogue, these roguelites that sort of come out of like this big, like grand age of game development on Steam. So the great roguelike age, I think, like the paragon for this is of course The Binding of Isaac, in my opinion. I have a lot of hours in Binding of Isaac, and I think that it builds upon that fundamental roguelike idea in interesting ways. First of all, it basically keeps random dungeon generation. It has a set of pre-built rooms that it assembles into randomly generated floors every time. So it's procedurally generated. It has permadeath, but there are some caveats now, and this is such a big innovation that it gets its own slide next. So just hold on for that one. It got rid of the turn-based. So one of the big mutations on the roguelike genre that Isaac did is it basically just ripped out the turn-based RPG like turn-based hack and slash and turned it into a real-time, continuous, non-grid based shooter game. And it really, really worked. And like it basically turned a game like a stale genre where it's basically a solved, like you have a dungeon, you pick up items and you take turns, you have expect-a-max or something, or mini-max algorithms running for the AI, and everything is very simple. This one turned everything on its head when it basically just changed the content or like the gameplay loop of the black box and then kept the whole like state machine the same. Complexity wise, it's pretty similar. Like there are many different ways to crack an egg. You could like bomb your way through the secret room or like try to escape in a difficult room. And there are even like different endings, so it's like branching in a way that there are multiple final bosses that you can choose to fight depending on your run or what you're doing. It still has resource management, and it's still like a hack and slash in that there are waves of enemies or like rooms full of enemies to kill and loot. But like most of all, like the biggest thing that Isaac changed, I think, like keeping like the traditional roguelike structure, even changing the gameplay isn't as big as what it did to permadeath. And it sort of subverted like one of the fundamental rules of permadeath, which is that you don't really keep anything between runs except, I guess, your knowledge. Because you do keep something between Isaac runs. There are two things. You can pass down money between runs. So if you're rich in a run, you can donate to the donation machine and then blow it up in subsequent runs to get that money. And additionally, you can unlock new items for later runs by completing various objectives, like beating a boss as a certain character, or like completing a run as a certain character on path A, B, C, D, etc. And there are a lot of characters in Isaac. So what this basically means is that you have to unlock like the vast majority of this huge range of items. And in doing so, and there's an important point to make here, is that even though you unlock new items over time, it doesn't make the game easier in Isaac, right? You're just as likely to unlock an S-tier item as you are to unlock like an F-tier item. And either way, those end up in your item pool and can make your runs better or worse on average. So there's reason to do more runs is to unlock new items and make more interesting dungeons available to you, as in dungeons that can generate more items. But it doesn't make it easier to win every time, which is an important distinction from some other games we're going to see. And so like what I like to think about here is that here's Isaac, but it has this new treadmill added. And what the treadmill effectively does is it makes the randomly generated world a randomly generated world that you can grind in to make the randomly generated world more interesting over time. So it makes the game bigger and therefore more replayable. And that was like the big S-tier innovation that Isaac added to the roguelike genre, in my opinion. And then other games would come after and refine Isaac further, like Enter the Gungeon. I basically just consider this is a simplification in my opinion. Enter the Gungeon is like Isaac, but they basically just made the combat better, and added a new narrative and like skin over it and basically polished it up in every way, but basically kept this fundamental same like game design idea. And then there's a game like Noida, which is a little more conservative, I'd say, in a way than what Isaac did, because as far as like permadeath goes, it's a lot more like the old roguelikes. You don't really you can unlock new spells, which I guess is like sort of Isaac-like, but again, it doesn't make the game easier. And what really matters between runs, or like what makes you likely to succeed in a Noida run, is more so your knowledge of the map and the enemies and the environment. Because you're probably going to end up 90% of the time blowing yourself up to a fungus or something. and not like the items itself. Like the spell system, like you can unlock new spells, but it's like a less critical part of the game, I feel. And other than that, like it reworked combat in the same way, aggressively in the same way that Isaac did to Rogue. But other than that, it's totally non-modal, as in you could basically just finish almost every part of the game in the first run. You could beat the entire final boss, you could explore the entire map, get all the perks, and there's nothing stopping you if you went crazy enough or you had enough knowledge ahead of time. And it's like infinitely complex. It endeavors to be a simulation, basically. And so there's a lot of emergent gameplay and complexity that makes the like the black box, the dungeon, more interesting to explore every time. But yeah, there's no like fundamental like breakthrough innovation here. It's just a really, really good example of a roguelike in the modern day. It subverts a little, but not a lot. Rogue Legacy, on the other hand, I think is another important one to talk about, because it subverts permadeath like Isaac does, but in a different radical way. But other than that, it mutates it gets rid of the turn-based grid style combat like normal. And in the case of Rogue Legacy, what's really happening is that you're supposed to... It spreads the complexity, or like the strategy of it, over multiple runs. So basically, and this plays into the permadeath. In Rogue Legacy, when you die, you get to preserve like your gold. And your gold is used to upgrade your estate, which makes you patently stronger every subsequent run. Right, so you're always getting stronger between runs. You always gain something from doing a run. I mean, I guess unless you die on the first room and get no money. But it's basically a game built around slowly getting strong enough to reach like the later parts of the game. And so it's like a roguelike in that you're constantly getting sent through this dungeon to progress. But it's also unlike a roguelike, or unlike other roguelikes like Isaac, in that it actually gets easier, I guess, over time. And so here we have like the standard diagram again, and then here I'd say like you're pumping up, you're getting stronger, and that allows you to scale the difficulty of the game, or like make a longer run basically that is more complex or has harder enemies, because basically, whereas like in an Isaac game where you can basically expect a run to have average level of power level. Like you'd expect an average Isaac run to have a certain level of power, plus or minus some variance based on like how good the items they got. Whereas in a game like Rogue Legacy, the innovation is that you're constantly like you can the expected value of a run over time goes up, and so therefore the difficulty or like the length of that dungeon can get harder and harder to compensate. And so that makes for a more longevitous, a long-lived roguelike game as well. So I think it's a good innovation. And now Hades is like one of the newest ones. It's definitely newer than Isaac and Rogue Legacy. It does random dungeon generation the same way, of course. It has permadeath. It's like Isaac, but it also brings in some other. You'll see. Just totally rips out the combat of the old Rogue games. And well, another thing I'd note about Hades is that it actually totally gets rid of complexity. Or not totally, but it definitely streamlines the dungeons. They feel more linear. You only have like 2 or 3 choices at a time. And the builds are... They fall into their archetypes. They're very simplistic in a way, I'd say. And in that way, it's sort of... The lack of complexity is a trade-off that you make for the rest of the game that you'll see, which is the added narrative and other measures in the permadeath system, basically, that make this game have insane longevity in spite of the lack of complexity in a given run. It also has resource management, you'll see, and it's very clearly a hack and slash, just like other games. But yeah, the innovation of Hades... Oh, what's happening? Okay, yeah, what Hades does really well is that it basically looked at what Isaac did when it invented like reimagined items every time, reimagining the combat and adding a ton of items to unlock. And it took aspects of Rogue Legacy, which is that you get stronger over time. And it basically did both of them at the same time, and it totally made it better in every way, in my opinion. So what it does is it takes from Isaac the unlocking new weapons, new ways to play through the level every time. That's basically analogous to getting new items. You get new builds in Isaac. You get new weapons to use in Hades. But it's also like Rogue Legacy in that you get darkness, gems, nectar, which are all currencies that you can use in between runs to basically improve yourself, like in Rogue Legacy, which allows it to basically scale the game, both treadmill-wise, right? We got new ways to play, but it also has like the power aspect, is that your power scales, and therefore it's scaling in two ways, and it makes a bigger square. It makes a more interesting generated world, or replayable world, in my opinion. But I just have to touch on this part because this is like an entire extra part of Hades. Is that Hades is a roguelike, yes, but they also basically just combined it with an entire narrative RPG, almost like, I don't want to call it a visual novel, but it sort of plays like a visual novel sometimes, where in between runs, depending on like how far you got, what events you completed, you also get to advance this like storytelling narrative in your hub zone. And the start menu between runs is replaced with this hub, which allows you to start runs from there. And it all works amazingly, and it plays they build off of these different mechanics, build off of each other to make a bigger, more replayable and interesting game. But yeah, you can see how. I don't want to go there first. You can see how we started here, right? And through these different innovations, we've basically created what I think is like a better game than what Rogue was from the get-go. And it basically, through these minor tweaks, they've created something more replayable. And so we have like this family tree, basically, as I view it, of like which games it inspired other games to go on and innovate in different ways. And I know I'm talking about Hades a lot, but I do really think that Hades is a really like an interesting design for a game, and I think it borrows a lot of wisdom from other games and basically is perfect. But yeah, something of note here is that my life as a gamer basically started with like around here when Isaac and FTL and these other games were coming out. So I don't have a knowledge of like what happened in this 30-year gap between Rogue in 1980 and Isaac in 2010-ish. But I imagine that there's some overlap here that I just don't have enough knowledge to cover. But yeah. So we have, as you can see, right, like we have the Isaacs that invented like gradual unlocking of new parts of the game, basically, and Rogue Legacy, which is gradually upping the power level and therefore the difficulty of the game. And then these innovations basically have allowed the genre to grow. But then there's like the terminology and like genre debate that goes on, which is like roguelike, remember the definition, are games like Rogue. And can you really say at this point that Hades is a game like Rogue? Well, yes and no. It borrows like the fundamental ideas and like the core structure of the game, in my opinion. But it's definitely mutated at so many points. I'd say for the better, grant you, but it's mutated at so many steps along the way that it's essentially, it's become less of a roguelike and more of a roguelite, which is not a bad thing. I think that people get up in arms about like, oh, that's a bad connotation, roguelite? That's worse than roguelike. But no, it's just, they're a little different, but we know where it came from now, right? So, yeah. In conclusion, I've beaten this to death at this point, but with roguelikes, I think that the fundamental defining feature is the way the way that we as developers think about the game, right? The goal should basically be to optimize this randomly generated world such that every time you get thrown into a run, it's interesting, it's fresh, even despite the thousands potentially of runs that the player has done before it. And the means that you do to achieve that are like, well, those are the things that have been invented in the past like 10 years or so, as I see it. I just rambled for a long time. Are there any like questions, comments, hot takes throughout any of this that anyone wants to talk about? Feel free to speak up at this point because the talk is done.